He called me senile. My own son-in-law dragged me off the stage of the church where I had given 40 years of my life. The choir froze, some too ashamed to look at me, others hiding nervous laughs. My daughter said nothing. That night, under the snow outside the stained glass, I realized the cruelest silence isn't when music stops. It's when your own family erases you. I remember the exact day. December 1st, 2023, in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The snow was falling heavy that rehearsal afternoon. Flakes struck the stained glass windows of the First Baptist Church of Grand Rapids, melting into thin trails of water, dripping like tears across the cold surface of the glass. I stood there, on the same stage I had walked for more than 4 decades, wearing my worn grey suit and a tie embroidered with little golden bells, a gift from Margaret long ago. Every time I wore it, I swore I could hear her voice whispering, "Tom, music begins in the silence of the heart." The choir was gathered. Men and women of all ages warmed their voices, some adjusting their glasses, others flipping through the pages of Adeste Fideles. The sound was familiar, a comfort I carried with me even after so many things had changed. That place was my second home, my altar, my refuge. The smell of polished wood, mixed with the faint wax of extinguished candles, embraced me like an old friend. I raised my invisible baton, as I had done thousands of times before, and breathed deeply to give the cue. The first notes came, timid and scattered, the tenors fumbling with their tuning, but I felt, just like every year, that with patience the voices would find each other. I smiled. Winter's cold had no place inside these walls, till his voice cut through the air. "Enough, Thomas." It was Daniel, my son-in-law. He entered from the side, each step striking the wooden floor like a hammer. He wore his expensive coat, hair slicked back, eyes sharp and rehearsed, as if every word had already been written in his head before he spoke. The room froze for a moment, thick with expectation. "You're losing the lyrics," he said, loud enough for every ear. "You can't keep up anymore. Better stop before you embarrass yourself, and all of us." The choir stiffened. I saw mouths half open, eyes looking down, hands nervously tightening around their sheet music. The weight of his words didn't just fall on me, it poisoned the air itself. I tried to respond, but my voice faltered. The word embarrassment echoed inside my chest like a blow. "Daniel," I managed, barely a whisper. He didn't let me finish. "Ladies and gentlemen," he went on smirking, "we need to be realistic. My father-in-law simply isn't capable anymore. He's senile." That word tore me apart. Senile. It rang out like a cracked bell. My face flushed, even though the draft from the side door sent chills down my spine. My back stiffened, my knees wobbled. The suit that once fit me well now hung like a reminder of how small I suddenly felt. In my pocket, the old tuning fork I had carried for years pressed heavy against my thigh. I remember clenching it with my fingers, as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. I looked at the singers. Some turned away, ashamed. Others let slip muffled chuckles, nervous or cruel. I couldn't tell which. Humiliation was not only in Daniel's words, but in the silence that followed. Even the associate pastor, standing near the back, lowered his gaze and scratched his chin, avoiding my eyes. No one moved to defend me. I tried again to speak, but my throat was locked tight. What could I say? That I had sung here for 40 years? That every Christmas service carried my fingerprints in the harmonies? That I had taught half these people to sing when they were children? The truth was there, burning, but no sound came out. The shame had stolen my breath. Daniel stepped closer and set his hand on my shoulder, not gently, but firmly, like someone moving an old chair out of the way. "Please, Thomas," he said, his tone dripping with false pity. "Sit down. Don't make this bigger than it is. Everyone knows." That phrase, "everyone knows," was the final knife. The lie became convenient truth, swallowed by silence. My vision blurred. I clutched my music folder tighter, as though it were armor. Inside were Margaret's old notes, coffee-stained sheets scribbled with her handwriting. "Lift mezzo here, Tom." Absence screamed at me through the paper. I stepped back once, then again. Nobody stopped me. The only sound was the faint hiss of snow against the glass. I walked the center aisle, each floorboard creaking like a protest under my shoes. Faces met me with pity, discomfort, or poorly hidden smirks from a pair of young tenors in the back. That stung more than the wind waiting outside. I pushed open the side door, and the winter struck my face like a slap. Tears welled instantly, whether from the cold or from the humiliation I couldn't tell. Snow covered the church steps. I descended slowly, clutching the folder to my chest, like an infant slipping from my arms. Behind me, whispers resumed. Not music, whispers. I closed the door with effort. Outside, the world was silent. The only sound was the crunch of snow beneath my shoes. Senile. The word looped inside my head, echoing with every step. Each falling snowflake seemed to repeat the same insult. I, who had given my life to teaching voices to rise, had been reduced in one breath to a senile old man. Have you ever been expelled from a place you helped build? Have you ever heard a word from your own family that cut you deeper than any stranger could? If you know this pain, leave your voice here, because that night, as I walked alone through the snow, I learned the cruelest loneliness is not being without people. It's being surrounded and treated like you don't exist. My name is Thomas Gerald Whitaker. I was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in the winter of 1951. My mother used to say, I arrived on a night when the cold itself was stubborn, slipping through every crack in the house, no matter how many towels my father pressed against the door. Maybe that's why I grew up learning that warmth doesn't always come from fire. It comes from people, from the sound of voices, from the comfort of music filling the air like a blanket. I was not born a musician. I was made into one. In 1972, I was just a young man with unruly brown hair and a restless energy that wouldn't sit still. I remember standing in the drafty basement of the First Baptist Church with a group of teenagers who barely knew how to hold a note and deciding we could make something together. That was the birth of the Voices of Grace, a choir that started with mismatched voices and grew into a tradition. I didn't have a baton then. I used my hands, my breath, my stubborn belief that harmony could hold people closer than blood. It was music that gave me Margaret. She was a literature teacher with eyes that seemed to underline every word you spoke to her. She came to one of our early Christmas rehearsals, not because she loved choirs, but because her friend was too nervous to audition alone. Margaret stayed for me. She told me later she noticed the way I leaned into the music, as though it were a conversation with someone invisible. That's how you love, she said once. And she was right. I loved her the same way I loved music, with patience, with attention, with awe at the way silence turned to meaning. We married with more sheet music than furniture in our first apartment. She filled the shelves with novels. I filled the drawers with hymnals. When our daughter Rebecca was born, the house sounded like lullabies off-key, but full of devotion. I would rock her in my arms and hum until she laughed at the funny vibrato of my tired voice. Margaret would stand in the doorway, smiling at us, as if she had already written the memory into a book. For decades, the choir and my family grew together. Christmases weren't just holidays, they were the climax of the year. Lights strung across the pews, the smell of pine wreaths, the hush before the first note of Silent Night. I wore the same ridiculous tie with golden bells every year because Margaret had given it to me in 1983 with a wink and the words, "It's tacky, Tom, but it's ours." I wore it like armor, a badge of loyalty to her, to the music, to the community we had built. My reputation was not mine alone. It belonged to the years, to the thousands of voices I had guided, to the shy boy who learned to stand tall on a note, to the young woman who found courage to sing through her grief. Music was never just sound. It was service. Every hand I raised to cue an entrance was a reminder, you belong here, your voice matters. That was the gift I tried to give over and over until it felt like breathing. When Margaret passed 9 years ago, the silence was deafening. Our house shrank. The rooms seemed too big, the nights too long. I walked into the choir loft the next week with red eyes and trembling hands, but when I lifted my arms, something miraculous happened. The choir breathed with me. They carried me through the silence she left. I realized then that music was not only my offering, it was my survival. Each rehearsal was a conversation with her absence, each pause a prayer she might still be listening. Rebecca, my daughter, grew up with this music in her bones. I built her a bicycle, fixed her bedroom walls, sang her through fevers and heartbreaks. When she brought Daniel into our home, I welcomed him with the same trust I gave anyone who promised to love her. I let him sit at my table, lead grace before dinner, speak as though he belonged. And at first, I believed he did. I wanted to believe it, for her sake. That's why it hurts the way it does now. I lived a life of discipline, faith, and devotion, not to myself, but to them, to my family, to the church, to the sound of people believing in something bigger than themselves. I wasn't rich, I wasn't famous, but I was respected. For decades, my worth was never in question, until age began to press against me, until the little slips of memory, the long breaths between notes, became weapons in the mouth of a man who should have defended me. You have to understand who I am to understand the cruelty of what happened later. I am not a perfect man. I forget small things. I lose my glasses more than I'd like to admit. I sometimes stumble on a lyric. But my entire life has been an act of giving, of raising others to sing when they didn't believe they could, of holding together a tradition that meant more than music. And yet with one word, senile, Daniel began to erase all of it. That's the tragedy of aging in a world that worships the new. People forget that behind the trembling hands is a lifetime of strength. Behind the slower steps are miles already walked. Behind the quaver in my voice are decades of music that carried entire seasons of faith. Do you understand now why the insult cut so deep? Why it shook the very ground I stood on? Because I was never just a man with a baton. I was a keeper of memory, a teacher of belonging, a witness of grace. And suddenly I was treated like nothing more than an old man whose worth had expired. It didn't happen all at once. That's the cruelest part. If Daniel had stormed in one day and stripped the baton from my hand, I might have fought back, but the erosion came slowly, disguised as jokes, as concern, as whispers passed just out of reach. At first, it was dinner-table humor. "Careful, Dad, don't forget the dessert in the oven," he'd chuckle, glancing at Rebecca for approval. I hadn't forgotten anything, but the laughter around the table gave the impression I had. Small seeds of doubt planted in soil, too soft to resist. The grandchildren giggled. My daughter smiled weakly, unsure whether to defend me or join in. I forced a laugh of my own, but inside, I felt the weight of being framed as the family's punchline. Then came the rehearsals. He started showing up to choir practices more often, leaning against the back wall with his arms crossed. He didn't sing, didn't contribute, just watched. His eyes scanned the room like an auditor checking for errors. After rehearsal, he'd linger near the door, his voice low but not low enough. He's slowing the group down. It's hard to watch. He gets lost in the verses, always within earshot of 2 or 3 others, never directly to me. That's how poison spreads, in whispers, not shouts. I noticed the way the associate pastor began addressing me. His voice softened, as though he was speaking to a fragile child. "Thomas, maybe take it easy today. You've done enough for us." Enough. The word stung. I didn't want to have done enough. I wanted to keep doing, to keep giving, to keep standing in the place I had earned. But the seed Daniel had sown was already sprouting in the pastor's mind. Even the choir members I had trained for years started hesitating before answering my cues. A soprano I once helped through stage fright glanced toward the back of the room, toward Daniel, before meeting my eyes. A tenor whispered to another. He missed the beat again, though I knew I hadn't. Their doubt began to creep into my own chest. Maybe I was slipping. Maybe I was the one holding us back. At family gatherings, the jokes sharpened. "Thomas, you remember the blessing, don't you? Or should I write it down?" His smile was wide, his tone light, but his eyes were hard. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, never laughing as loudly as he did, but never stopping him either. The grandchildren learned from his example, smirking when I stumbled over a word, rolling their eyes when I asked for a reminder. They were too young to know the cruelty of it, too young to see they were being trained to disrespect. The church community, too, began to mirror his narrative. At coffee hour, someone touched my arm gently, as if I were fragile glass. "Are you keeping up okay, Thomas? It's a lot, isn't it?" Their smile was kind, but it carried pity instead of respect. Pity is heavier than stones because you can't throw it back. You just carry it whether you want to or not. And yet, through it all, I tried to ignore the pricks. I told myself they didn't matter, that after decades of service, no one could truly believe I was failing. But late at night, alone in my house, the doubts replayed. I would sit in my chair with Margaret's photo on the mantel, staring at the lines of her smile. "Am I losing it, love?" I whispered once. The only answer was the tick of the clock on the wall, loud in the silence. The old tuning fork I carried became a ritual. Each rehearsal, before I raised my hands, I tapped it softly and held it to my ear. The clear pitch vibrated through me like proof. I still knew where middle A lived. I still knew how to begin. But when I looked up and saw Daniel leaning against the back wall with that smirk, the fork felt less like proof and more like a weapon I didn't know how to use. That's how the first stage of betrayal works. Not with an explosion, but with erosion, the slow grinding away of dignity until the person you once were feels blurred at the edges. I was not yet broken, but I was being shaped into a story that wasn't mine. Have you ever been made the butt of the joke by someone who should have defended you? Have you ever felt respect leak away one laugh at a time? If you know that sting, you know how betrayal doesn't need a scream to wound, it only needs a whisper. The breaking point didn't arrive with fanfare. It slipped into an ordinary Sunday morning, the kind of service where the sunlight filters through stained glass in 100 small colors, where the smell of old hymnals mixes with perfume and winter coats damp from melted snow. I had done this routine my whole life. Yet that morning, something shifted. The hymn was, "Great is thy faithfulness." I had sung it since I was a boy, taught it to Rebecca when she was small, conducted it every year at the fall service. My hands knew the motions before my mind gave the signal. The congregation stood, pages rustling, voices ready. I raised my arm, gave the first cue, and began. But before the second verse, I felt it, the interruption. A shadow moved from the side. Daniel. He walked toward the front with that confident stride, the one that always felt more performance than movement. He didn't wait, didn't ask. He placed his hand over mine, the one holding the hymnal, and gently but firmly pulled it down. His voice filled the microphone before mine could rise. "Let's keep the tempo strong," he said, smiling broadly at the crowd. His tone was charming, his delivery smooth, but underneath it I heard the claim, "He's not in control anymore. I am." The choir hesitated, glancing at me, then back at him. Some faltered, unsure whose lead to follow. My chest tightened. The congregation looked from one to the other, confusion settling like fog. I tried to step forward, but Daniel angled his body just enough to block me, keeping his smile for the audience while his eyes sent a private message. "Sit down. You're finished." I froze. In 40 years of standing at that front, no one had ever taken a hymn from me. I heard murmurs ripple through the pews. A woman in the second row frowned, whispering to her husband. A young man in the balcony tilted his head, uncertain. And then, what cut deepest, laughter. Small, nervous, but real. A few chuckles at the awkwardness, at the sight of an old man displaced by a younger, sharper presence. Rebecca sat in the third pew, her children beside her. She didn't move, she didn't speak. Her hands clutched her purse tightly, knuckles white, but her lips pressed shut. Not a word of protest, not a glance in my direction. She sat anchored in silence, and that silence screamed louder than any insult. I stepped back, my knees weak, the tuning fork in my pocket pressed against my thigh like a reminder of who I was, of the pitch I still carried inside. But in that moment it might as well have been a stone, heavy, useless. I felt invisible. The choir followed Daniel. The congregation sang on, though the tempo wobbled, the tone faltered. My absence hung in the room like an empty chair no one acknowledged. I watched them continue without me, as though my decades of leadership had been erased in a single motion. When the hymn ended, Daniel patted me on the shoulder, his smile wide, his grip sharp. "Thank you, Thomas," he said into the mic, as though dismissing me politely. The congregation clapped politely, awkward applause for the spectacle more than the song. My heart pounded in my ears. I stepped aside, down from the platform, into the shadows of the aisle. My body moved on instinct, but my mind screamed, "Is this who I am now? A relic? A prop?" For the first time, I wondered if maybe Daniel was right. Maybe I was failing. Maybe I was the one who no longer belonged. That thought sliced deeper than his words ever could. The service ended with handshakes and chatter. People smiled at me with pity in their eyes. A few avoided me entirely, unwilling to face the discomfort. I slipped out before the benediction, walking into the chill of the late morning air. Snow crunched underfoot, and the sky felt too wide above me. Humiliation doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers while everyone else keeps singing. Sometimes it leaves you standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by voices and still completely unheard. Have you ever been cut out of something you loved right in front of others? Have you ever felt yourself disappear in plain sight? If you have, you know the ache that followed me out of that church door, the ache of being erased while still breathing. After that Sunday, something inside the church shifted permanently. What had once been whispers and sideways glances became open conversation. Daniel no longer bothered to hide his disdain. He didn't need to. By then, the seeds of doubt had already taken root. He simply watered them in public. It began with a meeting. I wasn't invited to it, though the decisions concerned me more than anyone else. Daniel requested time with the associate pastor, the board members, and my own daughter, Rebecca. I learned of it only afterward, when a tenor mentioned offhand, "They're making some changes to leadership, probably for the best." I had given 40 years, and now the best meant my absence. From what I pieced together, Daniel painted a picture of me as a burden. He loses his place in hymns. He repeats instructions. He forgets what he's already covered. It's embarrassing for the congregation. He said it all with that tone of faux concern, the one that makes cruelty sound like compassion. "We need to protect him from himself," he insisted, as though stripping me of dignity was a form of mercy. Rebecca sat in that meeting. My daughter, my only child. She hesitated, I was told. Looked down, fiddled with her wedding ring. But in the end, she signed. Her signature joined Daniel's on the paper that removed me officially from any position of leadership in the choir. The associate pastor, under pressure, carried the document to me. It was a bitterly cold morning. The office smelled of burnt coffee and old carpet. He couldn't meet my eyes as he slid the folder across the desk. "Just until things are reorganized, Thomas. Time for you to rest. Rest. As though the music I had poured into this church were just a job I could clock out of. As though my purpose could be filed away with the minutes of a meeting. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply closed the folder, my hand trembling over the signature that looked so much like my daughter's handwriting from school assignments years ago. Rebecca Whitaker Lawson. I whispered it under my breath, tasting the betrayal like iron on my tongue. I left the office carrying my old music folder pressed tight to my chest. Inside were the pieces I had written annotations on with Margaret decades earlier. Softer here. Lift the sopranos. Her handwriting danced across the margins, living proof that I had not imagined my life's work. Outside, the church bell chimed Silent Night, its notes warped slightly by the electronic system. The irony stung. Silent night, indeed. That evening, I went to the sanctuary alone. The building was empty, the pews dark shapes in the dim light. I sat in the back row, the same place where I had once counseled grieving widows, nervous teenagers, lonely men who found solace in singing. Now I sat as one of them, grieving, nervous, alone. I opened my folder, placed it on the pew beside me. The paper smelled of dust and faint coffee stains. I pulled out It Is Well With My Soul, a hymn I had sung through funerals, storms, and wars of the heart. My voice trembled as I began, not because I didn't know the notes, because I knew them too well. Each word was a reminder of what I had lost. Though Satan should buffet, though trials should come, the words caught in my throat. Tears blurred the page. My voice cracked, faltered, broke. I let it. The sanctuary echoed back my broken sound, magnifying it, returning it to me as if the walls themselves were grieving. There is a kind of humiliation that ends in rage, but there is another kind that ends in silence. That night, mine ended in silence. I sat there long after the last note died, my hands gripping the pew until my knuckles burned. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't just about Daniel. It was about the way people let themselves believe convenient lies. It was about the way even my daughter, torn though she was, chose the easier side. And it was about me, about how I had allowed myself to be erased without a fight. Have you ever felt erased by the very people who should have carried your name with pride? Have you ever watched your life's work be signed away in a few strokes of a pen? If you have, then you know why I sat in that dark church, singing to no one, clutching an old tuning fork in my pocket like it was the last fragment of who I used to be. When you lose a title, you think you only lose a role. But when that role has been your heartbeat for decades, you lose yourself. After they removed me from the choir, the days blurred into each other, long stretches of silence stitched together by small noises that felt too loud. The ticking of the clock in the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the old radiator when the Michigan cold pressed against the windows. My bungalow, once warmed by laughter and rehearsals at the piano, became a hollow shell. The kitchen table stayed set for one. Dishes went unused. Cups gathered dust. I would boil water for tea, celestial seasonings, chamomile, because Margaret always swore it calmed the soul. But half the time, the tea sat untouched, growing cold in its mug, the rim leaving faint rings on the table. I stopped singing. At first, it was just a pause. I told myself I needed rest. But the days stretched, and my voice grew foreign in my own house. The radio sat on the counter, dialed to a Christian station. Occasionally a choir would play, and I would turn it down quickly, as though the sound itself were mocking me. Once, late at night, I left it on. They were playing a Christmas hymn, "Hark, the herald angels sing." My throat ached to join, but I stayed silent, jaw clenched, hands trembling. The sound filled the house, but I could not. The nights were worse. Sleep slipped away from me. I would lie in bed, staring at the shadows crawling across the ceiling, listening to the relentless tick of the clock. Sometimes I wandered into the living room, sat in the armchair with the photo albums spread open on my lap. Pictures of the choir through the years, young faces that aged into adults, couples that met under the choir loft, Christmas programs we built together, Margaret smiling, holding Rebecca as a baby. My finger traced the curve of her cheek in the photo until my eyes burned. The neighbors noticed. You can always tell when people are talking about you by the way they lower their voices, but not enough. At the grocery store, a woman I'd known for years stopped me with that soft, pitying tone. "Are you doing all right, dear? I heard—" She didn't finish. I nodded, smiled politely, but her eyes told me she already believed the rumor. Others whispered as I passed, "He's losing it. Poor man." The words stung worse than the cold wind whipping down the street. Even at church, the stares lingered. People greeted me too kindly, as if speaking to a child. The associate pastor once said, "It's good you're resting now, Thomas. You've done enough." Done enough. As though my worth had an expiration date. I sat in the back pew during services, no longer conducting, no longer leading, just another face in the crowd, though every brick of that building carried my fingerprints. One night I tried to sing, alone in the living room. I opened the old folder of music, found a hymn Margaret had marked decades ago. The page smelled faintly of dust and her perfume, long faded but still alive in memory. I lifted my voice. The first note cracked. The second trembled, the third broke completely. I shut the folder, pressing it against my chest. My hands shook. My body betrayed me the way my family had. I couldn't tell which hurt more. The hunger crept in quietly. Not for food. I ate what I needed, but for meaning. Meals tasted bland. The house smelled of stale air. The days carried no melody. Sometimes I forgot to eat until late at night, when my stomach growled loud enough to echo in the empty rooms. I dropped weight. My reflection in the bathroom mirror startled me. Hollow cheeks, tired eyes, a man unraveling. The tuning fork stayed in my pocket. I couldn't bring myself to use it, but I couldn't let it go either. I would hold it sometimes, tapping it gently against the table without lifting it to my ear. The vibration buzzed against my skin, a cruel reminder. The pitch was still there, even if my courage wasn't. Rebecca visited once. She stood in the doorway, coat still on, words trapped in her throat. "Dad, maybe it's better this way. Daniel just wants to help. You need to rest." Her voice faltered and she looked away, fixing her eyes on the floor. She didn't see me gripping the edge of the chair so tightly my knuckles ached. She didn't hear the storm in my silence. She left quickly, promising to call soon. The call never came. Loneliness has a smell. It smells like dust on curtains that haven't been drawn. It sounds like a clock ticking too loud in the dead of night. It feels like the ache of hunger even after you've eaten. It lives in the silence when you open your mouth to sing and no sound comes out. That was my life after they stripped me of the choir. Have you ever felt your house grow colder even when the heat was on? Have you ever known the weight of silence so thick it pressed on your chest? If you have, then you know what those nights were for me. Not just empty, but suffocating. It was a Tuesday morning in January when the routine cracked. The snow outside was piled high against the curbs, the sky the color of pewter, heavy and low. I had forced myself out of the house to the Grand Oak Diner, a small place with cracked leather stools and a bell over the door that chimed too cheerfully for the weather. The smell of frying bacon and coffee brewed a second time clung to the air. I sat at the counter, wrapped in my heavy coat, hands curled around a mug of chamomile tea that was already cooling. I wasn't expecting conversation. At that stage, I avoided it, but a voice behind me startled me. "Mr. Whitaker?" I turned, squinting at a man with a full beard and a wool cap, his breath fogging in the cold air he'd carried inside. He grinned wide. "Michael Harris, do you remember me?" The name hit me like a sudden note. Michael, a boy from the choir decades ago. Back then he was shy, barely spoke above a whisper, his baritone thin and uncertain. I remembered placing him between two stronger voices, telling him, "Borrow their confidence until you find your own." His eyes back then were wide with fear, but he sang anyway. I remembered that. And now here he was, taller, stronger, with lines at the corners of his eyes. "You taught me to sing," he said, sliding onto the stool beside me. "You probably saved me too. I was a mess back then, angry, lost. But the choir gave me a place to belong. You gave me that." I swallowed hard, the tea suddenly bitter. Compliments felt foreign now, like clothes that didn't fit. "You did the work," I muttered. He shook his head. "You gave me the courage. Without you, I wouldn't be here." He paused, then leaned closer. "I work as a producer now. Faith Channel 12. We're putting together the Michigan Christmas Gospel Festival this year. 3,000 people in the auditorium, live broadcast. I want you to sing." I laughed. It burst out of me, not with joy but disbelief. "Michael, I'm 74 years old. My voice—" I shook my head. "I don't belong on a stage anymore." His eyes didn't waver. "Your voice is a story. People are tired of polished perfection. They want something real. And you," he pointed gently at me, "you are real. You've lived the songs we're singing." The diner's bell jingled again as someone left, letting in a blast of cold air. I stared at the steam rising from my mug, at the faint reflection of my lined face in the liquid. Could I? Did I dare? Michael didn't push. He just sat there, patient, like I had once been with him. Before he left, he placed a card on the counter. "Think about it. Please, don't let them take your song away." That night I lay awake, staring at Margaret's picture. Her smile in the frame was gentle, eternal. I whispered to her, as I often did, "Should I?" The house creaked in response, the wind rattling the window. In my chest I felt a stir I hadn't in months. Fear, yes, but also longing. Michael came back a few days later. He didn't knock with questions. He arrived with conviction. "Come to the studio," he said. "No pressure, just try." The studio was small, padded with foam panels that smelled faintly of dust and glue. Microphones hung like waiting eyes. I stood in front of one, my hands trembling. Michael adjusted the levels, then said softly, "Sing one note, just one." I pulled the tuning fork from my pocket, the one I hadn't used in months. It was tarnished, edges worn smooth from years of my touch. I struck it gently on the table. The pure pitch rang, clear and unwavering, vibrating through my bones. I lifted it to my ear. Tears sprang instantly. The note was still true. I opened my mouth and sang. Just one note, long and shaky, but mine. The sound filled the small room, bounced back at me. It wasn't the voice of a young conductor anymore. It was older, cracked at the edges, but heavy with memory. I stopped, embarrassed, but Michael smiled like he'd just heard an angel. "That's it," he said. "That's what they need to hear. That's what the world has forgotten exists." For the first time in months, I felt something bloom in my chest. Not joy, not yet, but possibility. Have you ever had someone return from your past just to remind you who you are? Have you ever needed another person to hold up a mirror when you could no longer see yourself? If you have, you know why Michael's words began stitching me back together. Don't let them take your song away. The night of the Michigan Christmas Gospel Festival arrived like a storm I'd both feared and prayed for. The city glowed under Christmas lights, strung across lampposts, the snow piled high along sidewalks. The auditorium itself, 3,000 seats, everyone filled, buzzed like a living organism. Voices rose and fell in anticipation, coats rustled, programs crackled in nervous hands. Backstage, I stood alone with my old folder of music pressed to my chest. Beside were pieces I had carried for decades, pages stained with Margaret's handwriting. And in my pocket, as always, the tuning fork. My hands shook as I traced its worn edges. Michael came to me, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Remember," he whispered, "they don't need perfection. They need truth. Just give them you." The stage manager gave the cue. My knees nearly buckled. I walked toward the blinding lights, each step echoing in my chest like a drum. The curtain parted, and the world expanded. Rows upon rows of faces, lit by the warm glow of candles, passed through the crowd. The heat of the spotlight struck me full on, but my body still shivered. The announcer's voice boomed, "Please welcome Mr. Thomas Whitaker." For a heartbeat, silence. Then applause, not polite, not tentative, but a roar that rose like a wave. I froze, stunned. They knew my name. They remembered me. The music began, soft piano, the faint swell of strings. My chosen hymn wasn't one they expected, not Silent Night or "O Come All Ye Faithful." I chose something personal, a song I had written years ago, one Margaret had encouraged me to finish, but I had never shared widely. Its pages had lived hidden in my folder, waiting. Tonight, it would breathe. I lifted the microphone, my throat tightened, fear clawing at me. The first note scraped raw, my instinct screamed to stop, but then I reached into my pocket, touched the tuning fork. My thumb brushed its edge, and I remembered. The pitch was still true, so was I. I sang. The first verse came hesitant, trembling. My voice cracked, but I didn't hide it. I let the crack live, let the years and the grief pour through it. Faces in the crowd blurred through my tears. And then something shifted. As the melody climbed, so did my strength. My breath steadied, my chest opened, and the words I had buried for decades rose, clear and unashamed. The audience leaned forward as one. Some wiped their eyes. Others clasped hands, swaying gently with the rhythm. The glow of the candles flickered like stars in motion. Midway through, I saw Rebecca in the crowd. Tears streamed down her face, her hands covering her mouth. Beside her, my grandchildren stared, wide-eyed, as though seeing me for the first time. And in the shadows behind them, Daniel. His jaw tight, his arms folded, his mask cracking. He was no longer in control. The room belonged to me. By the final chorus, something remarkable happened. The audience stood, one by one, then all together. They rose, tears shining, candles held high. The sound of 3,000 people crying, clapping, praising. It thundered louder than any insult Daniel had ever thrown. I held the last note until my chest ached, then let it fall gently into silence. That silence lasted only a breath before the applause exploded, filling every corner of the hall, rattling in my bones. The ovation rose, wave after wave, as though they were not just clapping for a song, but for a life reclaimed. In that moment, the shame, the whispers, the meetings, the signatures, they burned away. I was not senile. I was not finished. I was a man with a voice, and my voice still mattered. The cameras from Faith Channel 12 captured it all. By the next morning, the video had spread beyond Michigan. 5 million views in 2 days. Comments flooded in from strangers. He sang what my soul feels. This is what worship is supposed to be. I cried for a man I never met. Daniel's name never appeared in those comments. His face, caught briefly by the cameras, stiff and humiliated in the crowd, told its own story. The community that had once whispered against me now whispered about him. His power dissolved not with confrontation, but with a song. Have you ever felt your truth drown out the lies? Have you ever seen the very stage used to silence you become the place where your voice roared? If you have, you know what I felt standing there, trembling and alive under the lights, with 3,000 people rising to their feet in tears. After the performance, after the lights dimmed and the applause finally ebbed into silence, I slipped backstage. My body trembled with exhaustion, my chest still heaving from the effort. The old music folder was damp from the sweat of my hands, and the tuning fork rested heavy in my pocket. A secret companion that had carried me through. I expected to be alone, but I wasn't. Rebecca was waiting. She stood near the dressing-room door, her coat still on, her eyes red and swollen. In her hand was a tissue crushed into a ball, damp with tears. The moment she saw me, she broke. She rushed forward, arms open, words tumbling out in gasps. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have spoken. I should have stood by you. I let him convince me. I let him make me doubt you. I thought I was protecting you, but I was protecting myself. I was weak. Words collapsed into sobs. She pressed her forehead against my shoulder, shaking. For a moment, I simply held her, my hand on her back, feeling her shoulders rise and fall with the storm of her guilt. My daughter, my little girl who once sang off-key in blue dresses at Christmas programs, who once held my hand as we crossed icy sidewalks, now trembling like a child again. I wanted to forgive her instantly. Part of me already had. But another part of me, the part that had sat alone in the pews, clutching Margaret's notes with tears streaming, knew forgiveness without boundaries would only invite more wounds. I pulled back gently, lifting her chin so her eyes met mine. My voice was quiet but steady. "Rebecca, you will always have my heart. Always. But listen to me carefully. What your husband has done cannot be undone. He took my dignity. He poisoned the choir. He spread lies. And you," I paused, swallowing hard, "you signed your name beside his." Her eyes flooded again. She nodded, unable to speak. "I forgive you," I continued. "But forgiveness does not erase consequence. Daniel will never set foot in my home again. He will never stand between me and the music that keeps me alive. If you want a place here, you'll have it. But it cannot include him." The silence between us thickened. I wondered if she would turn away, choose him again, leave me standing alone once more. But slowly she nodded. Not a weak nod, not reluctant, a nod of decision. "I understand," she whispered. "It's him who doesn't belong, not you." Her arms came around me again, tighter this time, the kind of embrace that doesn't beg for forgiveness but acknowledges truth. I closed my eyes, letting her warmth melt the ice that had built in my chest. Behind her, I saw movement. Daniel had appeared at the edge of the hallway, his expensive coat draped over his shoulders, his face pale with restrained fury. He stepped forward, his voice low and sharp. "Thomas, let's not make this dramatic. It was all a misunderstanding. I was looking out for—" I raised my hand, the same gesture I had used countless times to silence a choir before the music began. The power of that gesture, ingrained over decades, worked even on him. His words choked off mid-sentence. "No," I said simply. My voice was calm, not loud, but it carried. "You humiliated me in front of my choir. You called me senile in front of my family. You whispered lies until they believed them. And you taught my grandchildren to laugh at me." I took a breath. "There is no place for you in my life." His jaw tightened, his hands clenched. He glanced at Rebecca, expecting her to step in, to defend him as she once had. But she stayed at my side, her hand gripping my arm. That was when his mask cracked. He turned sharply, muttering under his breath, and disappeared into the crowd backstage. It was not a victory parade. No shouting, no grand declaration, just silence. The kind of silence that means a door has closed, firmly and forever. Rebecca stayed. She helped me gather my things, carried my coat when my hands trembled. She kissed my cheek before we left the auditorium. "I want to make this right," she whispered. I nodded. "Then start by teaching your children to respect what's true." That night, for the first time in months, my house wasn't empty. Rebecca and the children sat at my table. They laughed, not at me, but with me. I poured tea, and this time it didn't go cold. Have you ever had to forgive someone while still protecting yourself? Have you ever learned that love can stay alive even when trust has to be rebuilt brick by brick? If you have, you know what that night meant. Not a full restoration, but a beginning. One that drew a line Daniel could never cross again. 1 year later, winter returned with its old routines. Snow shouldered against curbs, breath turning to fog, the sky the color of pewter again. But the shape of my life had changed. The house no longer felt like a museum where I moved carefully around glass memories. It sounded different. It was full of footsteps that didn't belong to ghosts. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I took the bus to St. Mary's Mercy Hospital, a long beige building that smelled of antiseptic and coffee that had been sitting too long. In a sunroom that overlooked the parking lot, I gathered a choir that didn't audition and didn't apologize. Older men with oxygen tanks, women with hands that trembled, a nurse who sang alto between med passes, a physical therapist who kept time by tapping his pen against a clipboard. We called ourselves nothing. We just sang. The first time I stood in front of them, I didn't raise my arms like I used to. I stood with my hands open. "We will sing in the keys our bodies give us," I told them. "We will breathe when we need to. We will let the crack in the voice tell the truth." Heads nodded. Some eyes filled. A woman with a pink scarf over her bald head smiled at the floor, then lifted her gaze and met mine. I knew that look. It was the look of someone who had been told her voice didn't belong and had come anyway. I kept the tuning fork in my pocket. The metal was more tarnished now, but the pitch hadn't changed. Sometimes, before a song, I struck it against the windowsill and let the tone hum through the room. People closed their eyes. We started together, not always perfectly, but honestly. The hospital walls softened the edges of the sound and gave it back to us like a blessing. The tie with the little bells came out for the December concerts. It was still ridiculous. It was still ours. When I looped it around my neck, I could feel Margaret's laughter in my chest, the light kind that lifts the corners of the mouth without showing teeth. In the mirror, I didn't see an old man trying to be what he had been. I saw an old man being exactly who he was. Rebecca came often. She didn't rush to the front. She stood in the back by the coats, hands clasped, watching. The first time she brought the children, they were awkward with their own shyness. The boy perched on the edge of a windowsill. The girl tapped her shoe against a radiator and counted quietly. When we finished, "Oh, come, Emmanuel," the girl whispered, surprised at herself. "Mom, I was singing." Rebecca glanced at me and smiled, a small, careful smile, as if gratitude might startle and run if we made a scene. Trust came back the way winter light lengthens, almost without notice. Rebecca started showing up 10 minutes early, asking who needed chairs moved, who needed water. She stopped explaining me to anyone. She stopped apologizing for me. She asked questions that didn't seek permission. "What piece are you arranging next? Do you want me to bring the old hymnals from the church basement?" One afternoon she reached into her bag and pulled out a moth-eaten folder. "I found this," she said. Margaret's handwriting drifted across the margins like the memory of wind in trees. The note on the top page read, "Save this for a year when the snow is kind." I swallowed hard. "This year," I said, "the snow is kind enough." As for Daniel, his fall made almost no sound. That was the truest justice. No headlines, no dramatic expulsions, just invitations that stopped arriving, meetings he wasn't copied on, a circle of influence that quietly shrank until it fit in the palm of his hand. Once, he stood in the church foyer during coffee hour, looking for eyes to catch. People nodded, polite and non-committal. They turned to refill cups that didn't need refilling. He left early. I learned of it only because someone told me later, not out of relish, but as evidence that the world sometimes rights itself without our interference. The community changed too. The same mouths that had whispered about my supposed decline now spoke my name like a story they were glad to have witnessed. It wasn't flattery. It was correction. An usher approached me one Sunday and said, "I was wrong." He didn't explain further. He didn't have to. We shook hands, and the matter was closed. December arrived. The hospital sunroom crowded with coats and wheelchairs and an IV pole that squeaked because no one remembered to oil it. The windows fogged where breath met glass. We passed out lyric sheets printed in too large font. On the front page in small letters I'd written, "Start where you are." A patient in a blue gown gripped the paper with both hands. "I can't sing," he said. "Good," I replied, smiling. "Then you won't try to be perfect." We began with "Lo, how a rose ear blooming." The melody rose like steam from mugs of tea, thin at first, then gathering weight as it found the room. A nurse sang harmony under her breath. A man whose voice broke on every third syllable sang anyway, stubborn and luminous. The alto, with the tremor, found a straight line in the vowels and rode it like a rail. Outside, snow drifted sideways, wind pushing patterns we could not predict. Midway through the program, I tucked a finger into my pocket and pressed the tuning fork, feeling its cool certainty. I didn't strike it. I didn't need to. The pitch was in us now, the way a house remembers your footsteps, the way a river carves the path it will always take. I raised my hand, palm open, and my patched-together, full imperfect choir lifted their eyes. "Joy to the world" was our last piece. We sang it slower than most, letting joy be weighty instead of loud. On the third verse, the children came forward, mine and not mine. Rebecca's, a nurse's niece, a visitor who had wandered in and frozen like a deer until someone handed her a lyric sheet and she thawed. Their small voices threaded through the older ones, bright as bells. When we finished, the room stayed quiet for a heartbeat, and then the applause started. Not the sharp, performative kind, but the soft, surrounding kind that comes from people who recognize themselves in what they hear. A woman in a wheelchair pressed her hands to her mouth and wept without shame. A man in a hospital bracelet lifted his arms just enough to be seen and let them fall. The gesture of someone who has run out of strength and found something else to lean on. I bowed my head, not to receive praise, to agree with the moment. Afterwards, I wrapped my scarf and stepped into the parking lot. Snow sifted down in flakes so light they seemed undecided. The evening smelled of exhaust and cold iron and something sweet. Someone had opened a door and let cinnamon out. Rebecca caught up to me, took my arm without asking. We walked slowly toward the bus stop, the kind of slow that isn't about age but about consent. We were not hurrying away from anything. We were letting the night finish its sentence. At the stop, she turned to me. "I'm proud of you," she said. The words were simple, but they found their way into a room in me that had been locked and dark. I nodded, unable to answer. She squeezed my arm. The bus hissed up to the curb, doors folding open like pages of a book. We climbed aboard and sat near the front. A boy in a knitted hat watched me hold the old folder against my chest. "Are you a music teacher?" he asked. I smiled. "Something like that." Back home, I hung my coat on the same hook I'd always used. I set the folder on the table and unknotted my tie. The little bells flashed dull gold in the lamplight. I touched them and felt the old ache, smaller now, like a scar you massage without noticing. I put the tie away carefully. I rinsed my mug and set it upside down to dry. Before bed, I stood by the window. Streetlight turned the snow into a field of tiny mirrors. In the reflection, I looked like my father for a moment, tired at the end of a long day, content to let the house be quiet. I slipped my hand into my pocket and pulled out the tuning fork. I struck it once against my palm, softly. The note thrummed up my arm, into my chest. I lifted it to my ear and closed my eyes. As long as there is a voice, there is hope. I don't say it as a slogan now. I say it as a man who lost his voice in a room full of people and found it again in a room full of strangers. I say it as a man who learned that dignity isn't given by meetings or signatures or the opinions of loud men in expensive coats. Dignity is the pitch that remains when everything else detunes. If you've been silenced by family, by age, by lies, leave a word here that says you're still here. It doesn't have to be eloquent. It just has to be yours. Right, I'm still singing even if your throat is raw, especially then, because sometimes the world needs to hear a cracked note to remember what truth sounds like. Tomorrow I'll take the bus again. The sunroom will smell of sanitizer and peppermint lotion. The IV pole will squeak. We'll pass out lyric sheets that crumple at the corners, and someone will apologize for the way their voice shakes. I'll raise my hand, palm open, and we will begin together, imperfect, unafraid, unashamed. And when the last chord settles, I will whisper for myself as much as for them, the only benediction I trust. As long as there is a voice, there is hope.